Very glad, like I said, to have the Commission here. So first, to my extreme left, Professor Joyita Gupta, Professor of Sustainability from the University of Amsterdam, also co-chair of the Future of the Earth Commission and co-chair of UNEP's GEO. An extremely well-known and a major voice on questions of water, water governance, of law, and of dealing with questions of equity and justice in the water sphere. And we've learned tremendously from her over the last few months. And in some senses, if any one person could write this commission report, it might well be you. To my immediate left, Professor Quinton Grafton, one of the world's leading, thank you, water economists, professor of economics at the Australian National University at the School of Public Policy there, also an Australian laureate fellow, and somebody who's very passionate and has considerable experience in the areas of water justice. And he's again sort of exposed us to not only the challenges of managing water in Australia, but across other contexts, and the importance, at least for me personally, of being able to draw upon indigenous and local traditions who have actually managed water much more effectively than most modern societies have had in the Holocene and even before that. So he brings to us, I guess, a great depth of experience, especially on questions of agriculture and water management, use, its economics and valuation from across the world, having worked both in the southern parts and the northern hemisphere in some senses. And our colleague Xavier Leflave from the OECD, who leads the OECD's work, and the team from the Environment Directorate on water resilience and adaptation to climate change. Xavier has been very important in trying to look at water policy reforms pretty much across the world, and has helped us understand increasingly questions of dealing with financing of water, the institutional arrangements of that, which are actually one of the most serious barriers that we have at the moment, both to organized infrastructure and access in similar ways. So we have a wonderful panel here. We've been working quite hard, so I think you'll hear echoes of the conversations that we've been having for the last 2 or 3 days. So to go back to the earlier conversation and pick up on why this commission might be different, I guess the first thing is we are making a very bold claim, and that bold claim is that water is not only a public good, which is kind of established in many parts of the world, but water is a common good. So that's sort of one claim which is significant. There's been work on this. But more critically, and we've heard this from Dr. Krishnan just now, because the global hydrological cycle is actually being sort of significantly disrupted, and we heard about the monsoon. The monsoon actually impacts at least 2.5 to 3 billion people. We were talking about the impact of the monsoon on 1.4, actually no, it's 1.8 billion people if you take all of South Asia. Because of the changes in the global hydrological cycle, which are driven by anthropogenic interventions on land use and land cover in food systems, because the bulk of the water is used there, we are actually crossing, as like mentioned earlier, some of the critical limits on blue water, the kind of water that we use that flows both on the surface and below, and the groundwater we were talking about, but also serious challenges in the area of green water. So that's the first thing. So we are, for the first time, encountering challenges that cultures and societies across the world have dealt with historically. Throughout the Holocene, people have gathered and societies have thrived in areas where water has been available, right? Along coasts, along rivers, in areas which are actually quite high risk, right? Water is found around rivers because there are also areas where you have a lot of risk because of seismic activity and a whole range of other stuff like that. So people have actually flown to water, societies have thrived and have survived because of the availability of water. But in development today, in some senses, like Aditi was saying just now, water is significantly absent. Water is a sector, but it's not an organizing frame and principle. And I think one of the things that the Commission is trying to bring back into that discourse is, look, we can use as water not only as something that needs to be delivered as a service or a constraint, but as a way of trying to understand how we can reorganize development to deliver not only, greater well-being for people, and greater well-being for people does not only mean food and drinking water and health, but also the opportunity to work and livelihoods that are critically linked to that. In this country, half of the people in the country who live in rural areas all of their livelihoods are critically related to the monsoon and how water actually drives that. Similarly, in urban areas, a whole range of economic activities are linked to the availability of water. This city has struggled for the last many years because of the lack of availability of water. Some industries actually can't exist without that. Some are seriously challenged. So even in the industrial sector, there are a whole range of challenges which are imposed, or a whole set of livelihoods that become quite dangerous and difficult because of the lack of availability of water. And finally, especially in South Asia, we have a large proportion of, I think, the most vulnerable populations in this country who are dealing with the problems of externalities created by other people in this country. So they deal with the black water, they deal with the feces, they deal with all the trash that happens in our cities, and that has become an endemic part of society. So questions of economic and social justice are very critically marked and linked to. And this is not true all over the world, but it's very much true of this region. So in some senses, we can use, and we hope to be able to use water as a way of trying to reimagine how development can actually work itself out, so that we have better, health and well-being of people, so better enough food, enough water for both wash and other requirements, and also for livelihoods. But simultaneously, none of this can exist in a world in which there's higher variability of monsoon and precipitation and extreme events if we do not look at ecosystems and we look at the integrity of the ecosystems in terms of water. And biodiversity is a critical part of that. So we're pulling in multiple directions. So I think one of the challenges the Commission is trying to deal with just now is how do you balance out, in sort of an earlier framing, environment and development? How do you balance out the needs of humans and human well-being with that of the ecosystem? But you have to do that with at least two more constraints. How do you do that with equity and justice? Because we know that if you do not have equity and justice as far as water is concerned, you will have conflict. And a conflict in a world which has 8 to 10 billion people, or a subcontinent which has 1.8 billion people, is a very serious question. Our water conflicts are serious. We don't talk about them enough, etc. And finally, you have to do that on multiple scales. If that does not, you can think about global stuff, but eventually this has to boil up from local processes. And local processes are very diverse. They involve histories, geographies, different laws, different conditions. So you have to bring this together as a multi-level system with a whole range of actors. And I think economics as we know it, at least in my understanding of it, at least classical economics or even new classical economics, is not capable of dealing with problems of, like Aditi mentioned, 25 million bore wells, okay? 500 million farmers, or let's say 100 million farming families. The organization of the market to be able to coordinate and manage these mechanisms is something that's a very serious challenge, both theoretically and in practice. So in some senses, I guess, maybe I should open the discussion with Quinton and ask the question, because the proximate challenge we're facing in the world today is food, fine. This country is, we have enough food, we have poor food distribution, but we are mining our water, we have destroyed our surface water pretty much across the country. And we know the implications of even a small disruption in the global food system. We have a relatively small crisis in one part of the world, and the global food system is disrupted. People across the world are facing these massive rising prices. There's regime change that's happening in certain places. So, what is the nexus between food and water and agricultural change? And how would that play out for people in Africa, Asia, and even in Europe and North America, where food imports and exports are things that are taken for granted but will become worse and disbalanced in the future?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk, and thank you everyone who's come here this evening. These are big, big topics and big, big challenges, and it's a real pleasure to be here in India because Indians get it. They get it in terms of poverty, they get it in terms of understanding water scarcity, and they get it in terms of having too much, too little, and too dirty. I have to say, where I travel elsewhere in the world, there are people who don't get it, okay? So in the global north, people who are living in cities, they get their water off the tap 24/7, it's perfectly disinfected, they can drink it, all is good. They've got green spaces around them, they've got plenty of food, they've got money in the bank. But they don't get it because they don't understand, or many people don't understand, that the food that they rely on, whether it's Western Europe, many countries in the world, Africa included in the continent of Africa, they rely on their food from places like China and India, the United States, Canada, Australia, etc. And if there are challenges in those locations, the food-producing places of the world, and when we talk about food-producing places in the world, the top 20 countries produce pretty much the entire food calories. And then a smaller number actually export that food. So if there's challenges of groundwater depletion, which there clearly is, as was clearly emphasized to us in India, or groundwater depletion in the Western United States, or there's a whole series of issues around droughts associated with climate change in Australia, then that imposes big impacts in terms of food. And what we've seen in terms of the food or water energy food nexus is in 2008, 2009, 2010, we had prices skyrocketing that we hadn't seen until in the previous decades, until from the early 1970s and the 1973 food crisis. Now, those prices went up. Everyone started to talk about nexus issues. They started to get it. Why did they get it? Because there were subsidies for biofuels. That was one of the reasons. There was restrictions on food exports. That was another reason. And high energy prices. And that led to those food price shocks, put a whole bunch of people, about 70 million people at the time, into hunger. Prices changed. We moved on. The world seemed to be a happy place. Well, it's not such a happy place because, of course, we're facing the food price shocks that we're facing right now. Prices have somewhat eased, okay, in the last few months, but again, it's an energy shock, and it's again a food restrictions and exports. Those sorts of issues are going to get worse, and they're going to get worse for a variety of reasons. We've highlighted from Professor Krishnan in terms of the issues of climate change. But not only is it a climate change issue, it is a water issue, okay? They absolutely connected. And if modeling that I've done with colleagues for the Global Commission indicate to us that by 2050, so the people in this room, all of us I would trust, I hope, will be alive in 2050. So we're not talking, 100 years hence. We're talking 2050, okay? So 27 years away, like a generation away. There won't be enough food to feed the people on this planet, okay? So how does that going to be implemented? Well, it's going to be implemented because the ones who have the highest income and need to import food will get it first because they can pay the most for that, okay? And so the people on the lower down, both the poor in the global north, but certainly countries that have low per capita incomes, won't be able to access that food because it's not going to be there, or where it is, it's going to be at such a high price. So that's a problem, not just a climate change problem. It's not just a climate change issue in terms of heat stress and water stress. It's a water problem. And if we don't fix the water problem, we won't have enough food and we won't have the world that we want to live in. So we have to fix climate change, but we also have to fix water. And one of the points that was highlighted in the discussion from India is that we've got to connect these dots, okay? Some people have argued, and I can see why they've proposed it, let's plant a lot of trees to sequester carbon. So it started out as 1 trillion trees, and it's now 2 trillion trees target. But what happens when you plant 2 trillion additional trees, afforest or reforestation? Well, what happens? It affects the amount of water that's available in terms of blue water. And blue water is absolutely scarce at a global scale. It's certainly scarce in India, and it's scarce in a lot of countries, but certainly it's scarce at a global scale because of food trade. And so once we start to do that, we have implications for our water in terms of blue water availability, which then has implications on food, has implications for all sorts of things. So it's about connecting the dots, which is what the Global Commission is seeking to do, and it's a hard thing to do. There's so many dots to connect. But that food, energy, water nexus is a critical one. And the point I want to leave with, because there's others who need to talk, is that although it seems like doom and gloom, the Commission is not about doom and gloom. It is about presenting options for discussion, okay? Action, obviously, implementation. But we're going to propose a series of responses to the sorts of things that are going on in the world. And those responses need to go through a filter of people like yourselves, the people listening, the people here in the audience physically, through a series of societal dialogues is what we're calling them. Because we don't know everything. You know, there's other commissioners than just the three of us, 17 in all. So we need to get that evidence that's, hang on, that doesn't make sense. Do you know about this? What about that? So that's the continuation that goes beyond March 2023, which is the UN 2023 Water Conference, where we will need all your help, all the people on this webinar, to give us the feedback that we need to be able to continue this work for until 2024. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, what we are dropping is a very small pebble, but hopefully there'll be some ripples to be able to start or continue to build on the good efforts that are already out there, but to develop new initiatives, new actions, bringing in a whole series of values from around that are not on the table typically, and that we can bring about the change. And I say change, I don't mean incremental change, I mean transformational change. So the world that we live in 2050 is not the disaster world or dystopian world that could happen if we continue on our current path, but is a world that generates a just and a safe world for all of us.
So Joyita, Quintin's really set us up really well. We have a $100 trillion economy, which is suffering from serious nutritional crisis, and will also be now suffering from a serious food crisis. So SDG 2 in 2030 seems almost impossible to deliver. But my question to you is, most people don't realize that it's not only a question of water that underpins this, but it's also a question of land, of property, and how we deal with these questions which sit behind that. Because eventually, it's not only the water that flows in the land, but the water that flows below the land, the governance systems that actually manage this, and the inequities that are already sort of locked into the system at multiple levels. So, you know, do you have a even more serious provocation than Quintin?
Thank you. So I think we're going to start with a hypothesis, and my hypothesis is that if we cannot try to work towards a just world, it'll be impossible for us to prevent the tipping points in the climate regime and also regime change in water or anything else. So that's my hypothesis. And the reason is we do live in a world of $100 trillion, but the bulk of that money is concentrated in the hands of the top 1 to 10%. And they basically have access to all the resources of the world. It's not like they eat more breakfast than you and me. It's that their money, their investments, their pensions are investing in all the infrastructures that deal with water, land, food, etc. So there is a massive global inequality in who is accessing these resources, and it goes beyond not just the food storyline, it's also in terms of what do you do with your money when you're so rich? You buy land somewhere else. And when you buy that land in a country which is a post-colonial country, and very likely it has the English system of governance, which means if you own the land, you own the water all the way down to hell and all the way up to heaven. And that is a very strange system, but if you know that from outside and you buy the land, you also get right to water. And there's a huge growing literature on land grabbing and water grabbing that is now happening. And in fact, in one of the presentations earlier, there was a discussion about the fact that roads and infrastructures are being built on lands that should have been actually reserved for groundwater recharge. So what you're seeing is it's sort of a land grabbing, only it's the land grabbing done by the transport sector. And that may be also local, but it can be global. But what I want to come back to is that this problem of who owns water, let's just talk about that. If you look worldwide, then basically the way it's organized is each nation state owns the water in its jurisdiction. That doesn't mean that they own the molecule. So they own the water when it comes in, and when it leaves, they lose control. Then within the country, the water ownership is divided in different ways. That could be through the ownership of land. It could be through the ownership of infrastructure. We have cases where people have developed a dam and therefore got control over the water, and then they can provide it to people against a price. It can also be through, for example, contracts, which can run up to 99 years. And those contracts could be about mining, it could be agriculture, it could be land, it could be petroleum and oil. But if they run up for 99 years, you can't produce any of these products without water. So basically, governments explicitly or implicitly guarantee those companies the right to use this water for that period of time. And suppose tomorrow there's a shortage, or we heard about the monsoon fluctuations. So if the monsoon is fluctuating and the state needs the water back for redistribution, then suddenly they have to compensate those companies in terms of the lost revenue, which is very, very expensive. And by the way, this is not just a problem for the developing countries. A country like Spain is also facing problem trying to get control over groundwater. I want to move to justice, if I may. So the hypothesis is that if we have a world in which the water is going down in terms of availability, that means from an economic perspective, price is going to go up. But it also means that people are going to fight to get access to that water. And I'm talking about poor people, but also rich people. And this conflict, I'm not talking about war situations, I'm just talking about a conflict, which could be passive, implies that the demand for justice will go up. You'll see that in climate change. We've been talking about justice for the last 35 years, but it's only this year that they really fought. And that's because the space of sharing the greenhouse gas budget is shrinking so much that countries suddenly realize we have to demand justice now. So you'll find that as the supply decreases, demands for justice will go up. Secondly, you'll have extremes, so that's drought and floods. And that's something that's traditionally very difficult to deal with through the economic system. You can have insurance, but who can afford insurance? If you look at insurance maps, it's basically in the global north, but most of the global south does not have insurance, even for health, let alone for access to water. So the whole extreme storyline requires a completely different kind of justice narrative. Because maybe you and I have access to taps, but what about the people who have got to go to the hand pumps? And maybe they don't have any water in the tap, as was just explained. So there is a justice issue in terms of quantity. There's a justice issue in terms of quality. And I mean, if there's time permitting, I can also talk a little bit about the multi-level governance justice issues. But
Why don't you do that?
Okay.
Good to do that.
So the justice issues are actually layered justice issues in terms of water, but they're also, if you look at it horizontally, they're also justice in relation to land, justice in relation to food, justice in relation to climate, biodiversity, and so on. But I'm only going to focus on the water. So at the local level, of course, there is a problem of who owns the water and who can access the water, and the justice issues of indigenous communities access and local communities. There's slightly different principles operating for both. Then you have, of course, the role of cities. Cities are very rich, relatively speaking, so they basically grab the water from the surrounding areas, and they also pollute the water downstream. So basically, they're sending down their polluted water to the rural areas. So there's a justice issue, urban-rural. And then if you go up to the provincial levels, and of course you don't need explanations from me because of course in this particular area of the world, there's a massive interprovincial conflict about water sharing. Then if you go to the national level, now we have several transboundary agreements, but those agreements are sort of trying to maintain the relationships between countries, but it's becoming more and more difficult because the water flows and the water quality are changing. And so what we're seeing now is that even though that in the global community, we discussed this since 1966, and we adopted it in 1997, and it went into effect in 2015, there was a principle which said we must equitably share water between states. And in 2015, in the Agenda 2030, the SDG document, countries went back to full permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So they're basically saying we're not going to share our water, our land, etc. And you're seeing that this fear of the shortage of water is leading countries to move away from the idea of a local to global, common good or public good or whatever it is we would like to call it. And then at the global level, there's this discussion about not just how do you share blue water, how do you share green water, how do you deal with all these issues, and the fact that evaporation can move from one country to another, And if you have drip irrigation in India, then maybe there's less evaporation, which has impact somewhere else in the world. What does this all mean? So it's going beyond the transboundary blue water flows to perhaps transboundary green water flows, which can be quite frightening in terms of how do we govern it. But there are massive numbers of justice issues involved, and they're all layered. And somehow we have to mobilize a community of people to start thinking about this. And as you were saying, that there should be these discussions and dialogues, because without your input, we'll never get to a justice narrative.
Thanks. Savya, you've heard a very interesting sort of articulation of the set of problems that we have here. And many of the solutions lie in, the broad domain of governance and finance in some senses. You have tremendous experience across the world, working in Central Asia and Brazil, in Korea and the Netherlands, etc., of how one institutionalizes and enables these policy changes in practice. Because, there are institutional challenges, some are deep-seated, some are sitting in legal systems, in historical empowerment that's there. But how does one make this shift? And more important, how does one go beyond incremental changes into something that's sort of transformative? Because, we have very, very serious problems in this space. And the normal response would be, you have a scarcity problem, you can solve it with pricing, the market can sort it out. But will that actually work for all of these questions that we're dealing with?
Thank you, Aroma. That's, of course, an easy question. Before I get to you, I would like to thank the audience for inviting us, for hosting us, and also for giving us the opportunity to escape from the room where we've been literally tied to our keyboards for drafting over the last few days. So it's very refreshing to meet and engage with you. I don't have a theory of change that would allow us to transition from the current state of play to where we should move. But we can try to approach such a theory or touch on it, and I'd like to do that through the finance angle. Because we've heard very interesting stories during the first panel on how the fact that we tilted the hydrological cycle affect rain patterns, it affects variability, location of precipitation. And of course, that has impact on infrastructure. That has impact on how infrastructure are designed, how they are operated, and how they are financed. Think about a multipurpose dam, typically, which was initially designed to generate hydropower, for instance. With the new rain pattern, that hydropower dam now has to be operated through new rules. Typically, maybe keeping water, storing water to address scarcity issues or to prevent from flooding, meaning that it will not be able to generate the electricity that it was designed to deliver, which means that it will affect the revenue generation capacity of that infrastructure. So it's not just building differently, it's also operating our infrastructure differently and rethinking the business model of these infrastructure. So again, how do you transition from the current state of play to the new situation with these infrastructure appropriately designed, operated, and financed? I'd like to emphasize that this is not an issue specific to India. Of course, this is a global issue. We've done some work in Europe. We've done quite a lot of work in Asia with the Asian Development Bank on how to finance water-related infrastructure. There is no country which has reached the appropriate level of finance. In all European countries, including for water supply and sanitation services, even the richest countries like Germany, they still lack 25%. They should increase their budget for water supply and sanitation services by 25%. That's not trivial. And countries like Bulgaria and Romania, they need to multiply by 3 the volume of money they put to water supply and sanitation. And I'm not talking about flood management. I'm not talking about other bigger agendas. So this is really a global issue. And when you think about it, the answer is not about more money. It's not merely about more money. There is a very interesting study by the World Bank that shows that globally, only 75% of money that is allocated to water is being spent, meaning that on average, a country doesn't spend 1/4 of its available financial resources for water-related investment. How come? So pouring more money into a system that is not even able to absorb and spend what is already available would not make sense. So how to address that? At the OECD, we've done quite some work on these issues, and we have a three-pillar approach, if you like. The first thing is to make better use of existing assets, typically putting more money on operation and maintenance. Actually, building new infrastructure is quite easy. Financing that is quite easy. You know, there are financing models. You will find people who are willing and able to finance the capital cost because they know how to do that. It's much more complicated to generate the regular revenue stream to cover the operation and maintenance costs. And even in India, I think you have some experience of infrastructure, water infrastructure, which are decaying too fast because they are not properly operated and maintained. So that's one direction. The other direction, I think we could make much better use of available finance. There are ample evidence that shows that money doesn't flow where it should. It doesn't finance projects that would actually generate benefits on the ground. There are a number of reasons for that. We don't know how to plan for resilient water infrastructure. The point is not about having more plans. It is about having plans which really factor in climate change, the shift in the hydrological cycle, and how that translate into investment needs and infrastructure needs. We could design expenditure programs in a much more effective way or efficient way. It's not only about corruption, but corruption is one illustration of how public expenditure program can be ineffective. And I think a big element here about making better use of available finance is to allocate finance where it is needed. If you think about it, and I mean, again, there is ample literature on that. Public finance subsidies are not reaching the people who need them. We spoke about water tariffs. We spoke about, Joyita spoke very eloquently about justice issues. I think the design and the way public subsidies operate confirms that, actually public expenditure very often can exacerbate equity issues, whereas in principle they should be designed to minimize them. Official development assistance is not reaching the countries which are most in need. Official development assistance essentially goes to middle-income countries, and they are poorly targeted, and there is a huge opportunity here to redesign and redirect these flows. And of course, private finance, which is very often invoked as the way forward, comes with very significant biases. Private finance, as I said earlier, is quite competent to finance capital infrastructure for large infrastructure. This is, okay, fine, that's an easy way to spend a large amount of money, but that's probably not the best way to make concrete progress on the ground to guarantee access to safe water and sanitation. Think about rural areas. Think about decentralized systems, which are always very difficult to finance. So the allocation of finance has to be rethought. And of course, still in some contexts, you can think about it. You can think that it would be needed to harness new sources of finance. There are a number of options here that could be considered. I would like to focus on two for lack of time. First is, and that very much resonates with the work of the Global Commission, we have to acknowledge the multiple values of water, including non-market values. For the moment, typically, if I'm and for that, you can think about innovative financing mechanism, innovative type of analysis. If I'm a property developer, my land or my property gains value when the public sector invests on flood control or builds a reservoir to guarantee that my property will have access to water. I'm not footing the bill. This is a public investment, and I have the private benefit. There are fiscal instruments that exist, which are very well known for transportation systems. Typically, we call them land value capture mechanisms. How come they're not much more in use to finance water-related investment? The point about land value capture, is that you design a tax, a fiscal instrument, to generate a fiscal revenue from the additional value that a landowner or property developer gains from the public investment in water security. That's one option. That's one of the instruments that could be considered. One final point, to me, it's the new frontier. While we focus very much about how to access more finance, how to make better use of climate finance for water-related investment, there is huge opportunities to redirect investment which currently go towards projects and infrastructure that increase exposure and vulnerability to water risks. Financiers don't get it. I mean, to use Quentin's expression. Financiers, banks, institution investors, at the moment, they're not equipped to see how water risks actually affect their portfolio, affect credit risks, affect all these different variables that drive their decision. There is a huge agenda for the water community to put water on their radar. And if we can actually document how water risks affect cash flows, affect credit risks, that can really drive a reallocation of financing flows at scale. The idea is not to ask them or beg them to put a little bit more money into the water sector, is to alert them that if they don't factor in climate change and water risks, they will be exposed to a massive change in the value of their portfolio, and that will prevent them from delivering on their own mandates. This is a real challenge for the water community. It requires talking to different type of people. Typically, it requires talking to the regulators of financial industry and financial markets, meaning central banks. It's not even ministries of finance. It's central banks. It's the regulators of financial markets. This is one of the things that we are trying to do at the OECD. And actually, early February, we'll have a meeting of the Roundtable on Financing Water that we set up with the World Bank, with the Dutch government. And we're inviting central bankers to that conversation to see, to really try to alert them that if they don't factor in water risks, they will fail on their own prerogative, which is financial stability. We really see that as a game changer, and that's maybe something that the Global Commission would like to emphasize, and a message that they would like to convey.
Thanks, Xavier. Back to you, Quentin, here. So we heard from both Joyita and you an earlier thing that there's something deeply wrong with the way our economics, or our economies are structured. It's doing the wrong things,
Yes.
right? The wrong incentives, it's doing the wrong things. It's really exploiting things in the wrong places, and there's deep inequality. We heard from Xavier also about the serious challenges about the financial system actually not only being out of control, but doing the wrong things too. People just not getting it. In the climate space, we're starting to get some of that discussion and dialogue on the accumulation of risk. The question then is, can we do the same thing in the water space and link the water, food, energy nexus, right? But sitting behind that is, I guess, two difficult questions. One is all of this because of the fact that our economics is actually broken or doing the wrong thing? Or is it because we are valuing the most inappropriate things? And I think, Xavier touched on that just now. There are multiple colors of water. We lump that all into one bucket in some senses. We then try and put a value to it or a price to it, and then we try to find an equilibrium solution to that price. That might work for some things in some places, but given the diversity of the world, the fact that we are dealing with dynamic, far from equilibrium processes, is there something that we have to do to change our values and our valuation systems, and hence the kind of economics that deals with this kind of question, and hence finances, and hence justice which sits behind that?
Yeah. That's a really important question. I think economies are broken rather than particular disciplines, although every discipline needs to do better or get it. So what do I mean by our economies are broken? Well, pretty much the decisions about what happens, whether it's in finance, it's investment, it's infrastructure, et cetera, it's really focused around market values, goods and services that are traded in a marketplace. Understandably, that's how we see the world, that's us, that make up the individual people who live in an economy. but there's many, many dimensions that are not marketed. Okay, so what are those dimensions? Well, economists call them non-market values. Simply means they're not in the marketplace, but they're extremely important, whether it's biodiversity. Yes, there can be some market values with biodiversity, but principally not. There are market values with water. So in most cities of the world, okay, you actually do have to pay a price for water. So it is marketed. But what's not marketed, not fully considered, is where's that water coming from, whether it's an intercatchment transfer or where that water is being stored and the implications in terms of dams, etc. But also that is a transfer or reallocation of water. Is that being considered, etc.? So there are classic cases in India and around the world where there have been cities that said, hang on, we need to see whether we can get better bang for our buck, so to speak. And what they've done is they've invested in their catchments. It's around many places in the world. They've invested in their catchments, and in so doing, they've reduced the costs of treatment. That's a plus for them, but again, it's a market cost that they've reduced themselves by. So it's a plus. We've got green infrastructure and nature-based solution, but there's so many dimensions that are left off the table. There are issues around cultural values associated with indigenous communities, relational values. Economists typically have a very anthropocentric perspective and a very individual perspective, but there are community values. The values that others have and how we share those values do matter, and they're really important. So the bottom line is, we got market values, they're important. I'm not saying they shouldn't be considered, but there's a whole series of values that are not considered, not even thought about by some decision makers. We've got to put those values on the table. And there are methods for valuation. They're not perfect, but there are methods for valuation. Just like in the market system, the market price is not a perfect measure of value. If we think that, then we're mistaken, because at least economics has told us that, because there are external costs associated with a whole range of services and goods, and they're not built in to the market price. So we have to get the right valuation, and then it leads to the decision-making that's better. It's not going to be perfect, but it's a better decision-making. So at least the sorts of things that matter to us, we care about nature, we care about sustainability, we care about dealing with a series of risks, floodplains, as Aroma talked about. Floodplains, well, what's generating floods? Yes, well, it's climate change. Well, actually, let's go upstream and seeing what's happening in terms of forest or deforestation. That's one example, for example. Are those non-market values of the ecosystem services associated with what trees do, has that been built into the marketplace? Typically, the answer is no. So therefore, we don't get the right outcome. So it's a series of issues. It's not just about methods. It's about valuation, which is connected to methods, and it's about values. And if we don't get that right, we're not going to be able to have what I called earlier, and what many have also, and the Commission shares my views, it's transformational change. Transformational change is not about increasing the price of water by 5% in a particular city. That's not transformational change. I'm not saying that may or may not be a good thing in a particular circumstance. Transformational change is transforming how we value water, and then how that transforms how we decide what we do with water and how water connects to the landscape, the waterscape, and the economy.
Joyita, I mean, values are very critical to this process, but the question, I think, is if water is both a common good at the local level, and as you said, all the way up to the global scale, in a world which favors certain forms of competition, and the market is the most significant mechanism to organize these processes, how does one deal with this core questions you laid out of sharing? Fine. I mean, you can deal with it by setting up pricing and a whole range of things like that, but we know that doesn't necessarily work. So how does one set up a framework that enables and incentivizes collective action for the common good?
I would try to answer this question slightly differently at the different levels. So if I think of really poor people, and I think you want to raise the price of water to discourage their use, that's not going to help because it may end up excluding them further. So there I would try to think of a way in which you would either create rules regarding what is discharged into the water system if they are taking water directly from lakes or rivers or whatever. And I would also make rules regarding probably free access to water, not for all farmers, but at least for drinking water services. So maybe at that local level, one would need a different story. But when we talk about transboundary water sharing, I have not seen a single case where in the transboundary water sharing, the market mechanism is used. So transboundary water sharing is really about understanding the variation in the water flows, and it's about trying to see who has more power and therefore who can get access to that water. So it requires a different approach. And of course, there also we need the values, but there it can't be left to the market. If you're talking about trade and trading goods and services, now this is where the challenge I think becomes really complicated, because if I'm a farmer and I produce biofuels, I can make lots of money by selling it. But if I'm a farmer and I produce millets, maybe nobody outside of this particular country wants to buy it, and maybe I don't make that much revenue. So then the question is, how do we use this water in a way that both leads to some kind of benefit for the farmer, but does not lead to the misuse of the water going from millets all the way to biofuels? So this is the dilemma, and I see no solution to countries like India, which have a very strong water scarcity problem, to seeing whether we need to have a system of priority of use, which actually emerges from Islamic law, where it developed in dry countries. So they always had to figure out what will they do when they have limited water. So they came up with ideas, and this is also the value story. And once you decide what is water used for, in terms of different sectors, but also within the sector, different crops, and you're not leaving it entirely to the market. So, I mean, things that might work in the Netherlands are not likely to work in India. And I must say something about this, because about 20 years ago, the Netherlands was extremely proud of its water system. Everywhere I went, it was about, we should do water diplomacy. We can tell the world how to manage their water. And all we can see in the at least last 5 years, is the huge pollution crisis in the water system as a result of the agricultural, transport, and airlines emissions of nitrates and phosphates. And so it's not as if the rich countries have solved their problems, and they thought they could do it by using the market. It's not so straightforward. At some point, you just have to say, we can't afford to have more than so many animals, or we can't afford to have a system. So I would see my system of market shaping, in which I would really have a sort of a framework of rules and regulations within which the market operates, but not that the market decides the values that will be used. And this is also because also 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I was told that CEOs are much better than governments because they have a longer term horizon of thinking, and governments come and go, they have shorter term. But if you look at the Fortune 500 companies, the CEOs are there for 3.5 years. So they're not interested in the long-term future. So who is interested in the long-term future? Not the person who has no income. So who is interested in that? So we really need to have a sort of an ombudsman for the future, or an ombudsman for the environment, that creates certain rules within which, what we call in the report market shaping, within which the market functions. I hope that answers your question.
Good. Collective action. How do we mobilize collective action without finance and investment?
Will you allow me to take off my OECD hat?
Of course.
I'd like to use two words that we haven't used yet. One is social norms, and the other one is trade-off. What will really drive change on the ground are social norms. If you think about that, that's some sort of implicit principle that will drive our behavior. That's the condition for collective action. The other word, trade-offs, we have to acknowledge that there will be we can't reach a consensus. That's not an issue as long as I acknowledge that the person I disagree with are still people I can work with or people I can engage with. So Joita earlier today spoke about tensions, conflicts about water. There will be conflicts about how we value water, conflicts, tensions. I prefer your notion of tension. How we value water, how we use water. As long as, we can still continue to think about collective action and moving, collaborating together, as long as these tensions don't translate into, a moral or ethical level. If we reach that ethical level of tension, you will stop the possibility of addressing a trade-off. So collective action, to me, that's the definition of power. But power is not something that you impose on people. Power is something that emerges from a community, building on social norms and a community that have this mechanism of this capacity to engage with people they did agree with. That's my definition of collective action. And I will conclude on one point, one observation. In the water community, we talk very often about water war. We are very afraid about water tensions, water conflicts, and they generate into water wars. First, I would like to emphasize that according to international relations, evidence, there is no water war. There are water tensions, water conflicts, but there is no water war at the moment in the world. And quite on the opposite, water often is the last topic countries can talk about before they go to war. One of the areas in the world where I've been working was in the Caucasus. You may know that Armenia and Azerbaijan in particular are, at war. The only topic that they can discuss together, and you can sit them at the table in Georgia, because Azeris are not traveling to Armenia and Armenians are not traveling to Azerbaijan, but both countries can meet on a neutral territory, that will be Georgia, and they will meet in Georgia to talk about water. So water is actually maybe a source of tension, but it's also probably also the ultimate link that connects countries, and you could actually rethink, reimagine some sort of a multilateralism building on water. And I think that's the ultimate horizon, if you like, for the Global Commission. If we really consider the hydrological cycle as a global common good, there may be an opportunity to reinvent, reimagine multilateral relationships across countries, across territories, across communities, building on water. So water can be the terrain on which to rethink multilateralism.
Yeah, recognizing that water is life and that connects us all. So maybe we should just open up for questions here before we close. Any questions, responses, critical comments? Sure, please. Take this.
We have these planetary boundaries, we're learning so much about the water as a commons, from below the earth all the way to into the atmosphere. But when we have to, and also we heard from COP15 about this 30% target of land and water under some form of conservation. One model is, of course, you have these large areas which are reserved for water catchments or biodiversity conservation and all. But we are running out of those sort of opportunities. We have to keep those intact. But if we have to achieve our goals of water security linked to ecological, food security, and so on, it looks like we may have to have every landscape, every catchment, every piece of land have some form of a wetland, some form of recharge zone, some sustainable food production, and so on. So it's like almost like utopian, but we have to, that land sharing is in some sense an idea, but given the property rights, given the control over land and access and so on, it seems like almost impossible to achieve this land sharing that will enable all these ecosystem services and water security to be achieved. Any insights how we can go forward on this?
Look, Joito talked about everything is, you've got to be put into a context, and we live in a socioeconomic systems that differ depending where you are in the world. But one thing I would highlight, and others have said this times before, but I'm just going back to this, I'll say it the third time, we need transformational change at a global scale, global to local. Transformational change, in my view, doesn't happen unless there's a recognition of a crisis. Okay, so we can look to the climate world. Okay, so I recall in 1992, you know, the meeting in Rio, it was less than a success in a number of dimensions, but successful in others. And I thought at the time, in 1992, well, we've got enough time. We can fix this. I'm talking about climate change mitigation. I said, there's enough time. And in fact, there was enough time in 1992. Okay, we could have kept to 1.5 degrees centigrade if we'd made the effort that began in 1992. Of course, that's gone. 1.5 is gone. Okay, because the sense of crisis, the sense of the need for transformational change is only now in the last little time, the last few years, is being realized. And 2022, of course, was a critical year for understanding that across the globe. But if I look at the water space, people in the water space have known that there's been water crises that have a global impact. I would say at least the early 1970s, early 1970s. And there was, in fact, the UN Water Conference in Mar del Plata in Argentina in 1977. Okay, so that was the first UN conference on water. The second UN Water Conference is, in fact, March 2023. We're going to be part of that in the sense of delivering our report. But in that period of time, we're only now beginning, at most places, to understand the crisis. I said at the beginning, Indians understand the crisis because there is a crisis here. Australians typically understand the crisis, you know, because of the continent that we live in. But many, many people in the world do not get it. They don't get it. So until that happens, until people get that, until the decision makers get the influence from the people saying, hang on, you know, there's a real problem here that really affects me, whether it's flooding too much or too little or too dirty, and not just where I live, but in other places. Until that happens, we won't get the transformational change. And why is that? Because Xavier had mentioned it's the collective action problem. Okay? So what is getting in the way of the collective action problem? Well, because where water is scarce, the people who have the water do not want to give it up. Okay? And they're typically the ones who have the most power, the most influence in terms of decision makers, and the most income and wealth. And so that is a problem. And it's a problem in the climate change space and climate change mitigation. It is a problem in the water space. So we have to point out there's a crisis. We have to point out there's pathways forward to actually deal with this crisis in a transformational way. But we also have to understand that there are very, very big barriers in front of us in the sense of people who won't want that change. Just like fossil fuel companies haven't wanted change for climate change mitigation. There will be people who will stand in the way. And so we have to be part of that process. And that's the societal dialogues is about that. It's not about 17 commissioners. It's not even about presidents and prime ministers. It's about people getting together and saying, hang on, we've got to fix this. We have to change this. And until and unless that happens, until and unless there is that groundswell, I don't think we'll get the transformational change. I am hopeful. I'm hopeful this will happen. And I think the next few years will demonstrate to most people, if they don't or get it already, that the world is in a serious crisis when it comes to water. And then they will want that change to happen.
But I think I completely agree with everything Quentin has said, and I want to go to a step further, and that's the question of what is development. If we see our development as going from a low-income country to a middle-income country to a high-income country, and if high-income countries want to become even higher-income countries, then how do you raise your income? And the only way you can do that is if you commodify more and more of nature, because every product we use, every service we use, and every disposal we do involves nature. And so what we are seeing is that we really need to look at this concept of GDP and the concept of development. And this is really a dilemma. So it's a dilemma for a rich country because it basically means you may have to sacrifice a way of thinking, a very dominant way of thinking. I think it's a dilemma for the bank, but also for countries who have seen themselves as LICs, MICs, high-income countries, and they've seen a sort of a linear process. They've been classified in terms of income and GDP. So there is a bigger challenge. And if you look at a country like India, why do we have this problem of should we have more infrastructure here or should we save the water for the area for recharge zones? It's also because of the revenues you get and the possibility of a long-term income. And for some reason, people think if the rich world has been able to externalize everything for the last 300 years, then it's our turn to externalize in the global south. That's the only way to get out. And so it becomes a really complicated story, but I think it brings us back to what kind of society do we all want to live in. And this also brings you back to the value systems we want. But the question with value systems is, if somebody comes and tells you your value system should change, like suppose I come from India and I live now in the Netherlands, and if I come and tell you all, we shouldn't be looking at profits and you shouldn't be looking at your salaries and you shouldn't be looking at GDP, you'll say, yeah, that's easy to say. You live in a rich country, you have a good salary, and So it's basically the idea of moving away the ladder. Like, you got it, and so now you don't want us to develop. So there's a big dilemma here. And the question is, we really have to sit together and figure out what kind of world we want to live in. And it's not easy. And when you so the idea of shaping people's values, shaping people's ideas can be also extremely patronizing. Who are you to tell me that my values should change? So it becomes a really complex process, and it's very difficult to deal with. So one of the stories we have in collective action theory is you need really a top leader who can mobilize change. You need a Gandhi, who can sort of lead the whole country in a very strong way to achieve independence without weapons. So you need a leader at the global level. At this moment, I don't see a global leader who's willing to stick his or her neck out, though our Secretary General has also said very clearly, the UN Secretary General, that GDP is an outdated concept and we have to throw it out and we have to start thinking again. But I think I leave that here. So it's up to you to tell me what kind of development you want.
Good. I think that's an interesting place to close because we are out of time. We could keep going on this, but I think we have to get back to our keyboards. Yeah? So thanks, folks. Thanks so much for joining us wherever you are, including here. It's been a very interesting conversation. I think lots of new dilemmas have emerged and lots of ways forward too. The question is, how are we going to actually bring it into action? It's nice to have ideas, but the ideas have to work on the ground, especially as far as water is concerned. Sure. It won't flow uphill, it won't go out. If you have the power, you will try and control it. We know all these factors there. So thanks so much. It's been a really good evening. We're very glad to have you here. And hopefully, yeah, we'll be able to bring the Commission back in its full-fledged avatar at some point of time into a really fiery societal dialogue in India. That'll be fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much.